Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to Disrupting the Narrative podcast, where we talk about issues that shape our communities. I'm Amira Rasool, and today we're going to be diving into the topic of ICE enforcement and asylums. Today I'm here with Jana Al Akhras, an amazing immigration attorney and an activist who has worked on the front lines of justice for asylum seekers and immigrant communities. Can you just briefly introduce yourself and your work in immigration law?
Yeah, of course. My name is Jana Al Akhras. I am an immigration attorney. I work for Urain and Associates. It's a law firm based out of Brooklyn, New York. I'm the senior attorney there, and we focus primarily on removal proceedings, so asylum, family reunification, federal mandamus litigation, and just pretty much the whole thing.
The whole thing. Yeah. Can you explain to just everyone what asylum is and the basics of understanding what that is and how people go around applying for that?
Sure. So an asylee is somebody who is seeking refuge. It's not specific to the United States, but the idea in the United States in particular is that anyone who can prove that they have faced past persecution or will have a well-founded fear of future persecution based on something that they can't necessarily change about themselves. So their race, their religion, their nationality, if they're a member of a particular social group. The idea is that you have to prove not that the country conditions that you're fleeing from are terrible, but that there's something about you that puts you in a unique perspective that you would be facing a harm if not granted refuge in another space. So for example, currently what we're seeing in Sudan, for example, there's a active genocide. And ever since April of 2023, we've seen the Rapid Support Forces targeting members of African tribes in Sudan, right? So though there's an entire war in all of Sudan, not everyone in Sudan can apply for asylum. It has to be that you're facing a particular harm based on one of those enumerated characteristics. So due to your, ethnic group, you're being targeted. You can seek asylum on that basis.
Really interesting, and that can come from any country really that is seeking to asylum. And that's also giving the answer of like why people usually come to the United States with the freedom of leave to everyone.
Yeah.
How are asylum seekers being treated differently now compared to just a few years ago? Have you noticed? Because I know you've been working for how long now?
I've been an immigration attorney since January of 2021. So it's been about 4.5 years.
Yeah.
Right? Is that right?
Yeah.
I would say that, how asylum seekers in particular have been treated has definitely regressed over the years in the United States. But the interesting thing, and I think that a lot of people don't talk about this, is that, immigrants in this country are pretty much on the lowest rung of the social ladder. And we saw changes that were made to our immigration processes in this country during the Obama administration and then in the Trump administration. And then we saw things that were getting worse in the Biden administration and then in the second Trump administration. And the interesting thing is that people tend to believe that it's these Republican administrations that are making everything worse. And they absolutely are. But when we have then a Democrat in office, they're not rolling back the problems that were created. We just maintain the status quo and then things continue to get worse. So when we're talking about things like asylum, what's currently happening at the border in terms of making it almost impossible to seek asylum was something that was started by the first Trump administration by something called Title 42. And then it was codified and continued through a law under the Biden administration called the Circumvention of Lawful Pathways, which extended that ban. And now we have the Trump administration, which has essentially shut down that part of the border. Do you understand what I mean? And so it's a steady trajectory of just getting objectively worse. So what's the answer to how have asylees been treated? Progressively worse is the answer.
Never, especially with the amount of, I'm guessing how many you guys get even at your firm, like how many,
absolutely,
like can only imagine, like the pressure in the United States. What legal grounds does ICE typically use to justify like raids or detentions, and how solid are those foundations from like a civil rights perspective, do you think?
So, ICE is able to rely on reasonable suspicion when they're conducting these raids. But reasonable suspicion, what is not a constitutional basis for reasonable suspicion is your skin tone or what you look like, your phenotype, right?
Yeah.
But what we're seeing is kind of an unprecedented action taken in terms of what is legal and what is not legal.
Yeah.
So what can ICE rely on is one thing, and then what are they actively doing is another.
Yeah.
And I would say that, what we're seeing is the absolute fracturing of communities. We're seeing people who are living in fear. We're seeing people who have, applied for asylum and are waiting for their court date, and they're still getting detained. We're seeing people who are showing up to their court hearings, their mandated hearings, and they're getting their cases terminated at the hearing and then being picked up by ICE outside the courthouse. And so you're creating situations in which it's not just that, like, a lot of the times when we talk about immigration, we just tell people this blanket, do it the right way. Just do it the right way and everything will be fine. But the interesting thing is even people who are quote unquote doing it the right way are being punished and are living in fear. And so you create circumstances that make people not want to abide by court hearings, or they don't want to show up, or they don't want to go to their ICE check-ins because they're terrified.
Yeah. What are the age demographics? I'm just curious of like what you really see recently.
With our firm, a lot of the times they're young men.
Okay.
And the reality is like the journey to, you can't seek asylum unless you're inside the United States.
Right.
Okay. So it's not like you can apply for asylum from outside of the United States for the United States. You have to physically be here, right? So what does that mean in order to get to the United States? It's a journey. It's a very difficult one, right? The vast majority of our clients will, if they're coming from Mauritania, or they're coming from Sudan, or they're coming from Guinea, or wherever the case is, they land somewhere in Latin America, and then it's a journey between, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras, Guatemala, Mexico before they're coming. That's a very challenging journey to make as someone who's not probably like in their 20s and early 30s or whatever the case is. So, I mean, asylum seekers of all ages and, both like are of all genders and all ages. But what I tend to see in my practice is a lot of young men who are fleeing, trying to, secure their space in the United States, and then ideally petition for their family members.
Yeah. And they're coming all by themselves then and starting from scratch usually.
Yeah.
Is there a case recently that you think would be good to walk through? I know everything else can be confidential, but anything that would give us pointers on to understand what right now what it's like?
Well, yeah, I mean, when it comes to, it depends on the type of case. So like what we're seeing, it's not just specific to asylees. Like obviously I do asylum practice and things like that, but then generally immigration law is also being, the parameters of what we know to be legal and lawful are being challenged.
Right.
And so, we've seen in the past year or so, following the executive orders from January, I think it was January 20th of 2025 of this year, those executive orders that we all saw that were about, anti-Semitism and all of those types of things, basically criminalizing speech, criticizing Israel, right?
Yeah.
And so those are not asylum seekers. Those are people who have lawful status in the United States through, their F1 visas, their student visas, or whatever the case is. And we recently had a case that was similar to the, Mahmoud Khalil case, the Rumaysa Ozturk's case, like all of the people, these big names that we've seen of people who have had their lawful non-immigrant status. Well, in Mahmoud Khalil's case, he was a legal permanent resident, or ideally, hopefully still is a legal permanent resident. We'll see. But you see situations in which people have this lawful status in the United States, whether it's to work or study or whatever the case is, and that being challenged by their speech or for the purpose or based on their speech. And the speech in this case is criticizing of Israel. So we had an OSU student who was a grad student. Who he's a national of India, and he was here studying on a student visa, had been accepted into a PhD program, had attended some Palestine protests on OSU's campus, in particular the night that Ohio State called state troopers on their students. Yes, exactly, that encampment. And so he was there at the encampment, and then his name was obviously publicized after the fact, and then maybe about a year later, he received an email from Ohio State informing him that he had lost his CVIS status, which is his the portal that holds your student information, and that his visa had been revoked. and that he was no longer able to continue to work with his work authorization at the university. And grad students, how they make their living, they teach, right? And so we took on the case and sued the Trump administration and the vast majority of the leadership in that regard. So you have, Rubio, you have your Pam Bondis, you have your Christy Kikanom, you have all of these, and sued on the basis that there was no justification for terminating someone's status on that basis, right? So we sued the Trump administration. We're still in an ongoing litigation on that because we also are suing for the revocation of his visa, and we believe that that revocation was unlawful. His student status has been reinstated. Nice. He is, we got a temporary restraining order enjoining the government from continuing to take any sort of action based on that initial termination. So that's pretty cool. Things are moving in that direction, but it's still really scary. I think as we're seeing new types of Supreme Court precedent that are being set, like for example, birthright citizenship. The Supreme Court just recently ruled. I'm not sure. I mean, the way that executive orders tend to work, right, is that an executive order is issued by the President of the United States, and it's supposed to now be this new law or this new process that goes. What an Article 3 judge, which is a federal judge, can do is block those executive orders. And the reason that they can block executive orders is if they find something to be unconstitutional, right? So people bring lawsuits in their respective courts, and then federal judges issue nationwide injunctions. The Supreme Court just held that federal judges do not have the power to issue nationwide injunctions, meaning that if a federal judge agrees upon something, then it doesn't count for the entire nation. It means that each individual state or each individual area has to bring that own litigation and then handle it internally in that way. That's just completely unprecedented. So then you have a question now as somebody who was born after the executive order was issued to non-US citizen parents on US soil. Are they or are they not a citizen? And then the question is where were they born? And you'll only really find out is after the birth certificate is issued, will they give that person a passport? And the question, you can still do it in New York, but can you do it in other spaces? Now, I believe it's 22 states that may be in question, whether or not that person is an American citizen. And so things are changing on a daily basis. And we're in a very precarious time. Right now.
I can imagine, especially with literally coming into it with learning everything you guys know to it's switching on a daily. I can only imagine. That's just crazy. Do we know this? You said 22 states.
Yeah, I believe so.
Wow, that's just.
Yeah, I had one of my attorneys ask me today, we have an asylee who's about to give birth, and is that child going to be a U.S. citizen? And I had to respond, it depends. And I've never had to, you wouldn't think you had to answer that question in that way, particularly it's enshrined in the Constitution.
I just think it's interesting how that is even a topic of discussion. If somebody is born in it's just the idea of birthright. If you're born in this land, you should have that citizenship, whether or not your parents, that goes on to lineages of lineages.
I think the reality is, the next step to all of that, right? If you can challenge birthright citizenship, then you can start to challenge things like naturalization. And so then you can start to denaturalize people based on what? The criteria for these types of things is supposed to be very, very clear. But when we make everything a matter of national security, and national security is something that cannot be reviewed in these particular, what I'm saying? When we create situations where, I don't like to be an alarmist, right? But we're not on a slippery slope anymore. We're in a steady downhill. It's a downturn. And it's almost as though litigation can't catch up fast enough. And I think there's so many things on fire at once that I think sometimes the challenge in doing this type of work is that you have to convince people that it is as bad as you think it is. You know what I'm saying?
I was going to ask you what the shift in your mindset had to be this year of the way you respond to certain things. I know that probably is the terminology you use of even you said the response of someone asking you, they're asylees and have a child, will they have citizenship? You can't answer that question for them. I just think that just shift in that is crazy. Do you guys have a predicted if it's on a downfall of what else? Because you said, once they are able to attack one thing, it's going to keep going.
Well, I think you remember during the kids in cages
Yes.
era, right?
Yes.
And we're creating what you can only call concentration camps in this country.
Yeah.
People are, the Department of Homeland Security is actively saying that they're monitoring people's social media, that they're monitoring the things that
Yeah.
you're posting. Like,
Yeah.
you know, we already know that prisons in this country tend to be for profit, so they make more money the more beds are filled.
Yep.
So next logical question is if you're building these detention camps,
Yeah.
you have to fill them.
Yeah.
And how do you fill them? And the problem is like, not the problem, I mean, it's all a problem. Like, human beings should be treated with dignity and respect regardless of their quote unquote legal status in this country. But we have communities and communities that are mixed, like mixed status. Like, not every single person around you is a citizen or a green card holder or whatever. And so the scary part about all of this is that we haven't even begun to see just how fractured our communities are going to become. And I think even from like a sociological perspective, like, it's not good for communities to be on constant high alert. Like, it's not good for family structures to constantly be on high alert. Like, I have clients who have been told to show up to their ICE appointments because they have to do consistent check-ins, and at their ICE appointments are being detained and thrown into but I'm saying, but they're actively calling us as their attorneys on the phone. They're saying, I'm at my ICE appointment and I'm being detained currently right now. Is there anything you can do? And I can only ask for the ICE officer's name and their information and figure out where my client is being shipped off to. And the problem is that a lot of the times they're being shipped off and then they get put in something called expedited proceedings. So what typically happens is when, again, you come into the United States, you get a court date, you show up to your court date, you get set a final court date. And between the time of your first date and your last date, you have time to prepare your case, to gather your evidence, to work with an attorney. And the courts are so backed up that sometimes people don't have hearings until like 2026, 2027, 2028. But then when someone gets picked up in an ICE appointment,
they're going to be left there for that.
They get they get put in something called expedited proceedings, and suddenly they have a court hearing in 2 months.
Wow.
And so what does it mean for the attorney who used to have 3 years to prepare for a case? Now I have 2 months to prepare for a case, and I have to call my client while they're in detention, and maybe I don't get through on that phone call. What if I don't get time to put evidence together? What if I don't get time to prepare him before his hearing? Now, at the end of the hearing, there's a determination with a judge saying, I found you credible or I don't find you credible, and there's no preparation beforehand. You know what I'm saying? And so you're creating a system in which you're just treating
failure, just set up for failure.
Exactly.
Literally set up for failure, which makes a lot of sense. Because if it's on this, just downhill, we're going to do this, and the next one we'll do this. Of course they want it to be a failure situation. Of course that's what they want to do. My next question was going to be about these conditions that you're hearing that your clients are facing in these centers.
I mean, they're awful. They're awful. If you listen to people's testimony, like, there's even like reports from human rights organizations, particularly of the centers that are in Louisiana. They have some of the highest human rights abuses in the country. There's like rampant sexual assault. People are not fed food that is like, I won't even want to say fresh. Like, they're just not, food is a generous term for the things that they're given. They're put in situations where they don't really often have access to legal counsel. They're supposed to have pro bono opportunities if someone, like, if you request it in that way, but you're not entitled to an attorney in immigration proceedings in the same way that you would be in other capacities. So we have, our clients are, in situations where they can at least have attorneys advocate for them. But a lot of these people just find themselves rotting away in these detention centers. I had a client who was from Yemen, and we filed something called a habeas petition, which is, exactly, which is on the basis of unlawful detention for extended amount of time. And Yemen is also on the temporary protective status list, so it's called TPS, which technically means that the United States cannot deport anybody to a country that it designates is on the TPS list. There's a few countries, and that designation constantly gets changed depending on the Attorney General's recommendation. But he technically couldn't be removed, and so we filed a habeas petition because he had been detained for over a year without parole, without a bond determination, without any of that. And then they dropped him off in Egypt. They moved him to 3 facilities, and then by the time that we were calling, they responded to the lawsuit after we had filed it and said, well, he's no longer here, so what relief are you looking for? And then when we found out where he was, like, how did you send him to Yemen? he doesn't even have a travel document. Like he didn't have a passport. How are you going to dropped him off in Egypt? And that's not uncommon anymore.
Crazy.
So
right now, that's just like the
yeah.
Assalamu alaikum. We hope you enjoyed our podcast episode today where I discussed with our guest speaker, Jana Al Akhras, immigration attorney and activist, the difficulties asylum seekers are going through right now, and as immigration attorneys, what they're facing in this political climate. If you ever are in need of any type of resources, please feel free to contact any of the numbers you see on the screen. There is countless resources available, whether you are a student, whether you are a professor, a staff member, anything. Please contact these numbers. Also, please be aware, in this climate, what you post, use your voice, use everything, but be aware of your resources and be smart and help each other. Come back for our next episode where I will be discussing with another group more just cases, sadly, on ICE immigration. So be sure to check out our next episode.